18th of April 1947, 1300 hours. Aboard HMS Lasso, 17 kilometers off the German coast, a Royal Navy officer presses a single firing switch. On the tiny North Sea island of Heligoland, buried inside a submarine bunker and a labyrinth of tunnels carved through red sandstone cliffs, roughly 7,000 tons of surplus wartime ammunition detonates in a single, coordinated instant 4,000 torpedo warheads, nearly 9,000 depth charges, and more than 90,000 artillery shells of every caliber the British Army had accumulated across a continent. The explosion is, at that moment, the largest deliberate non-nuclear detonation in human history. The island itself visibly changes shape. This is not an accident, and it is not an act of war. It is disposal, on a scale that required 2 full years of planning to execute in a single afternoon. This is not where the fighting ends. It is where an entirely different kind of battle begins, against a mountain of leftover ordnance nobody quite knows what to do with. Victory in Europe leaves the Allies holding an almost incomprehensible surplus. Across the British occupation zone alone, ammunition dumps sprawl through former Wehrmacht depots, forest clearings, and captured underground storage facilities. Artillery shells, aerial bombs, naval mines, and small arms ammunition accumulated not just from Germany's own surrendered stocks, but from years of Allied resupply that had, by May 1945, simply stopped being needed. Destroying it safely, rather than simply abandoning it in place, becomes an urgent occupation priority. Since unstable, deteriorating explosives left scattered across a defeated country represent exactly the kind of hazard no occupying authority, once sitting quietly in a forest near a rebuilding town. But that was only the beginning of the problem, not the solution to it. In July 1946, British engineers test the scale of what they are dealing with at a dump near the town of Soltau in northern Germany, detonating a portion of the stockpile in an explosion powerful enough that seismographs register the shockwave 50 kilometers away. The test confirms what planners had already suspected. Conventional demolition, dump by dump, dispersed across dozens of sites, would take years and expose disposal crews to constant risk. Something more concentrated and considerably more ambitious would be required. The documents reveal something the popular memory of post-war disposal rarely captures. The choice of Heligoland was not incidental. The tiny archipelago, barely a square kilometer of land 46 kilometers off the German coast, had been comprehensively evacuated during the war's final bombing raids. Its roughly 2,000 residents relocated to the mainland, with no fixed date for return. British occupation authorities, inheriting an already empty island honeycombed with wartime bunkers and a submarine pen known as Nordsee III, recognized an opportunity that solved 2 problems simultaneously: a secure, uninhabited location to concentrate the region's surplus ordnance, and a permanent way to deny the island's considerable military infrastructure to any future German government that might, in British strategic thinking of 1946, wish to use it again. Another problem soon emerged once the plan moved from concept to execution. Filling the Nordsee III bunker and the surrounding tunnel network with explosives proved far slower than initial estimates suggested. Naval engineers spent months packing torpedo heads, depth charges, and crated artillery shells into damp, poorly ventilated spaces never designed to hold detonators and TNT in such concentration, working through a German winter in confined tunnels where a single mishandled shell carried consequences far beyond the individual carrying it. The original deadline, set for the 31st of March 1947, slipped by more than 2 weeks as the sheer physical scale of the loading task outpaced the schedule drawn up in a planning office months earlier. Picture the scene in those final preparatory weeks. Engineers moving crate by crate through sandstone corridors lit only by portable lamps, the tunnels growing steadily more crowded with material that, taken together, represented more raw explosive power than had been used in many individual wartime bombing raids, all of it sitting silently beneath an island that had only 2 years earlier been a functioning naval base with families living above the very chambers now being filled to capacity. Yet the most consequential decision had already been made months before the first crate was loaded. Rather than distributing the risk across dozens of smaller detonations at scattered sites, British planners chose deliberate concentration. One location, one enormous controlled explosion, timed and observed from a safe distance, rather than managed piecemeal across a landscape still recovering from war. The approach carried obvious risk if anything went wrong during loading. But it offered something dispersed disposal never could: a single, verifiable, unmistakably final end to the immediate problem. On the day itself, small charges are detonated first deliberately to frighten migrating seabirds away from the island before the main event. A flotilla of Royal Navy observation vessels holds position well offshore. Photographers and officials watch from a safe distance as the countdown reaches its final seconds. When the detonation comes, it reshapes the visible profile of Heligoland's coastline, an act of destruction so complete that the island's very geography bears its mark for decades afterward. What followed was, in its own quiet way, more complicated than the explosion itself. Heligoland remained under British military control for years afterward, used first as a bombing range for further ordnance testing, before finally being returned to German administration in 1952. Its residents allowed home to a landscape permanently altered by the detonation that had, on paper, been designed to make the island safer rather than stranger. But one detail rarely makes it into the popular retelling of that afternoon in April 1947. The explosion did not simply destroy the ammunition stacked inside Nordsee III. It reshaped the physical outline of the island itself, collapsing sections of coastline and altering the profile of cliffs that had stood largely unchanged for centuries. A piece of German geography permanently redrawn not by wartime bombing, but by the single deliberate act of cleaning up afterward. Even now, unexploded ordnance from the wartime years continues to surface across Germany more broadly. An estimated 2,000 tons recovered annually from construction sites, farmland and old military ground. A reminder that Operation Big Bang, however dramatic, resolved only the concentrated stockpile Britain chose to gather in one place, not the far larger quantity scattered more quietly across the rest of the country. Debriefing assessed as a demolition and risk concentration problem rather than a combat operation, Britain's disposal of surplus wartime ammunition reveals three defining pressures and one lasting geographic footnote. First, the sheer physical scale of surplus ordnance accumulated across the British occupation zone made piecemeal, site-by-site destruction impractical, pushing planners toward concentration rather than dispersal as the only method capable of resolving the problem within a reasonable time frame. Second, the choice of Heligoland reflected strategic opportunism as much as pure logistics. An already evacuated island with existing military infrastructure solved a disposal problem and a longer-term strategic concern about denying that infrastructure to a future German military in a single decision. Third, the operational friction of the loading phase, months of confined, hazardous work-packing damp tunnels with detonators and high explosive, demonstrated that even a plan built around eliminating risk through concentration still demanded a lengthy, dangerous preparatory phase before the risk could finally be discharged in a single controlled moment. The lasting geographic footnote is written into the island itself. Heligoland's coastline today still bears the visible imprint of the explosion that was meant to erase its usefulness entirely. A small patch of the North Sea permanently reshaped, not by the war that generated the ordnance, but by the singular deliberate act of getting rid of it.